Okay, imagine this. You're trying to build a whole new country from scratch, basically. But 9 out of every 10 people, well, they're farmers. Just focus on growing food.
That was America in 1790. 90% farmers. It's kind of staggering when you think about it.
Right, and yet, amidst all that farming, this brand new republic is figuring itself out.
And that's what we're diving into today. The Federalist era. Roughly, 1789 to 1801.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the big policies, both domestic and foreign, that really set the foundation.
So if you're looking to get a solid grasp on this crucial time, quickly but thoroughly,
Yeah.
this is your shortcut. Understanding how the U.S. really started under the Constitution.
Yeah, we've dug into a bunch of historical accounts covering this period, and our mission really is to pull out the absolute key insights. How did this idea of the United States become, well, real, a functioning nation?
Let's start by setting the scene. America, 1790.
Okay.
Population, just under 4 million, but growing incredibly fast, doubling every 25 years or so.
Wow.
Yeah, and mostly rural, still. Those cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, they were definitely starting to grow.
But most people weren't living west of the mountains yet, right?
Not really. Only about 5% lived west of the Alleghenies. The country was still very much clustered along the coast.
And the financial picture? Not so rosy.
Oh, far from it. The government was saddled with massive public debt. Revenue was way down.
And the paper money?
Practically worthless, both state and national. A really shaky foundation financially.
Plus, think about the context. They'd just overthrown British rule, then scrapped the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, two governments tossed aside in quick succession.
Yeah.
And they had Britain and Spain kind of looming, posing real threats.
And even while juggling all that, the country's actually expanding, new states coming in.
Right. Vermont joined in 91, Kentucky in 92, Tennessee in 96. Ohio wasn't far behind, 1803. So immense challenges, but also growth.
And stepping into this whirlwind, George Washington.
Unanimously elected, still the only president to achieve that.
It just shows the level of respect he commanded, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Some historians argue Congress was even willing to give the presidency more power because they knew Washington would be the one wielding it initially.
And he set some really key precedents right away, like the cabinet.
Exactly. The whole idea of the president consulting department heads, it seems obvious now, but the Constitution doesn't mention a cabinet at all.
So it's part of that unwritten constitution people talk about.
Precisely. Initially, just 3 departments: State with Jefferson, Treasury with Hamilton, War with Henry Knox.
And the Attorney General came a bit later.
Right. Edmund Randolph, after the Judiciary Act of 1789, set things up.
And this early cabinet, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it? Between Hamilton and Jefferson especially?
No, not at all. 2 brilliant minds, but with fundamentally different visions for the country. They were clashing almost immediately.
And right near the top of the agenda for this new government was the Bill of Rights.
A huge priority. Remember, the Anti-Federalists had serious concerns during ratification.
Right. Many states only agreed to the Constitution on the condition that these rights would be added. Quickly.
Now, amending the Constitution, it's designed to be tough. 2 ways to do it.
One is a big national convention called by the states, which has actually never happened.
Never been used. The other way, the one we know, is Congress proposing amendments, then state ratification.
2/3 in Congress, 3/4 of the states.
The Federalists, having just gotten the Constitution ratified, were pretty wary of another big convention.
Yeah, they probably worried it could unravel everything.
So James Madison really took the lead. He drafted the amendments, drawing a lot from George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights.
And by 1791, those first 10 amendments were adopted, the Bill of Rights.
Cornerstones, really. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, vital stuff.
Then you've got the Fifth Amendment, rights of the accused, due process, life, liberty, property.
And don't forget 9 and 10, really important.
Okay, refresh us.
Number 9 basically says, just because we listed certain rights doesn't mean those are the only rights people have.
Got it. Unenumerated rights.
And the 10th Amendment. That's the states' rights one. Powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people, really hammering home that federalism idea.
Another huge piece of early legislation, the Judiciary Act of 1789, setting up the courts.
Absolutely foundational. It organized the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay plus 5 associates initially.
And the lower federal courts, too, district and circuit.
Yep. And it created the Attorney General's office.
Our source mentions something called a fatal provision in that act about compelling appointments.
Ah, yes. The idea that the Supreme Court could force the president to appoint judges, that specific part got knocked down later in Marbury v. Madison.
Right, the case that established judicial review. Okay, makes sense.
So the courts are getting set up. But the really big controversial thing shaping the early republic, Hamilton's financial plan.
This was huge and sparked immediate, intense debate.
Totally transformative. Hamilton laid out his thinking in reports like the Report on Public Credit in 1790. His core idea.
Favor the wealthy, basically, with the hope it trickles down.
Sort of. He believed that by securing the support of the wealthier groups, the government would gain stability and creditworthiness. Prosperity, he argued, would eventually spread.
And he pushed for manufacturing too, right, in his report on manufacture.
Yes, strongly. Advocated for a factory system using tariffs to protect those new American industries.
Okay, so pillar one of his plan, funding at par. What did that mean exactly?
It meant the federal government would pay off all its debts, national and state, at their full face value, plus interest.
Sounds reasonable. Build credit. But there was a catch.
A big one. During and after the war, those government bonds had tanked in value. People sold them for pennies on the dollar just to get some cash.
And who bought them up cheap?
Speculators. Often wealthy insiders who guessed the government might eventually pay up.
So when Hamilton proposed paying face value,
Those speculators made a killing, while the original holders, often soldiers or ordinary folks, got basically nothing for their early faith. Hamilton got a lot of heat for that.
you can see why. Okay, next part. Assumption of state debts. The federal government takes them on.
Right. Hamilton wanted to tie the states more closely to the federal government. He saw national debt, maybe controversially, as a kind of national blessing, a unifier.
But states like Virginia, which had paid off a lot of their debt, weren't thrilled about paying for, say, Massachusetts' debt.
Not at all. Big north-south tension there. Massachusetts had huge debts, Virginia less so.
Which led to some classic political horse trading, the Compromise of 1790.
The famous log rolling. Basically, Hamilton and Jefferson cut a deal.
What was the trade?
The South agreed to let the federal government assume the state debts in return. The new national capital will be built in the South, on the Potomac.
Ah, the District of Columbia. Planned by L'Enfant, surveyed by Benjamin Banneker.
Exactly. Jefferson apparently later regretted making that deal, felt Hamilton outsmarted him.
Okay, so funding, assumption, what else? Tariffs.
Yep. Taxes on imported goods. The Revenue Act of 1789 was the first one, about 8% on average on dutiable goods.
Main goal, raise money for the government.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Pay down that debt. But also, secondarily, to protect those fledgling American industries Hamilton wanted to encourage, give them a bit of breathing room against foreign competition.
And then there were excise taxes, taxes on domestic goods.
Right. Introduced in 1791.
Yeah.
The most controversial one by far was the tax on whiskey.
Which really hit the folks in the backcountry hard. Why whiskey specifically?
Well, out west, roads were terrible. Transporting bulky grain to market was expensive, difficult.
But whiskey is concentrated value, easier to ship.
Exactly. Much more portable, much more profitable. In some places, whiskey was basically used like currency.
So it felt like taxing their main economic engine. And Hamilton...
Didn't seem overly bothered. A lot of those backcountry areas were hotbeds of anti-federalist sentiment anyway. He might have even seen it as a way to assert federal authority.
Which brings us to maybe the most explosive part of his plan. The Bank of the United States.
The real centerpiece. And the issue that truly ignited the feud between Hamilton and Jefferson. This wasn't just about finance. It was about the meaning of the Constitution itself.
So what was the bank supposed to do?
Hamilton saw it as crucial. It would be partly owned by the government, partly by private investors. The federal treasury would deposit its surplus money there.
Okay, a safe place for government funds.
And critically, it would issue a stable national currency, something the country desperately needed.
Washington knew this was big, right? He asked for opinions.
He did. Asked both Hamilton and Jefferson for their written views on whether it was constitutional.
And Jefferson's view was?
Strongly opposed. He and others who favored states' rights were deeply suspicious.
Why? What were the fears?
Fear of centralized power, basically. That the bank would benefit wealthy elites, speculators, northern merchants, at the expense of farmers. That it would undermine state banks and threaten liberty.
And his constitutional argument.
Strict construction. He argued the Constitution didn't explicitly give the federal government power to create a bank. Therefore, it couldn't. Simple as that.
But Hamilton had a different interpretation. Loose construction.
Exactly. He pointed to the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause.
Ah, the idea of implied powers.
Right. Hamilton argued the bank was necessary and proper for carrying out powers the government did have, like collecting taxes and regulating trade.
So a much broader view of federal power.
Definitely. And Washington, despite Jefferson's arguments, ultimately sided with Hamilton. Signed the Bank Bill in 1791.
Another win for Hamilton, but it deepened the North-South divide.
For sure. The bank favored Northern commercial interests, and it really marked the point where the Hamilton-Jefferson split became an open political battle.
And all this tension, especially over things like the whiskey tax. It eventually boiled over, didn't it? The Whiskey Rebellion.
Oh yeah, 1794, Western Pennsylvania. The Whiskey Boys, as they were called.
Sounds dramatic. What happened?
They saw the excise tax as completely unfair. Resistance grew violent, attacking tax collectors, tarring and feathering, burning buildings. There was even talk of secession. Tax collection just stopped.
How did Washington react to this direct challenge?
Decisively. He called up a militia force of about 13,000 men. Think about that size back then.
Huge. Did he lead them himself?
He actually rode out with them part of the way. Hamilton went the whole distance. They saw it as a critical test for the new government.
And the rebellion.
It basically collapsed when faced with that kind of force. The rebels scattered. Washington later pardoned the couple of guys who were convicted.
So the significance. It showed the new government could enforce its laws, unlike under the Articles with Shays' rebellion.
Exactly. A powerful demonstration of federal authority. But the Jeffersonians were appalled.
Saw it as government overreach, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Pretty much. They condemned the massive military response, and it actually drove more people into their camp, strengthening the opposition.
So, looking back at Hamilton's overall impact, pretty profound despite the controversy.
Undeniably. He put the U.S. on a stronger financial footing, established national credit. His loose construction idea opened the door for expanding federal power later on.
His manufacturing report even looked ahead to the Industrial Revolution.
It did. But all this also solidified the opposition, rallying people around Jefferson's vision of states' rights and limited government.
Which leads us directly to the birth of political parties, something the founders actually didn't want, right?
Generally, no.
Yeah.
They tended to see organized opposition, factions, as dangerous to the Republic, disloyal even.
There were Federalists and Anti-Federalists before, but those weren't quite parties in the modern sense.
Not really. They were coalitions built around a specific issue ratifying the Constitution, not permanent organizations seeking broad popular support.
So how did we get from that aversion to, well, Federalists versus Jeffersonian Republicans pretty quickly?
It grew organically out of the fights over Hamilton's policies. Jefferson and Madison started organizing opposition within Congress.
But they didn't initially intend to create, like, a permanent party structure.
Probably not. But as the disagreements deepened, especially over the bank and foreign policy, these groups started to solidify.
And by the early 1790s, say 92, 93, you had two distinct camps emerging.
Yeah. The Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, or Democratic Republicans.
Well,
The clash between those two men, Hamilton and Jefferson, really was the seed of the American two-party system.
let's quickly contrast their core beliefs. Federalists first. Who were they? What did they want?
Federalists generally drew from the upper classes. They believed government should be run by the best people, educated, wealthy.
A bit distrustful of the common person, fear of mobocracy.
Definitely. They favored a strong central government to keep order, protect property, pro-business merchants, shippers, manufacturers, mainly in cities.
And foreign policy, leaning towards Britain.
Yes. Partly economic ties, partly cultural affinity. John Jay summed it up. Those who own the country ought to govern it. That was their vibe.
Okay, now the Jeffersonians, Democratic Republicans.
They championed rule by the people, though often meaning the literate, informed citizenry. More faith in the common person.
Appealed more to farmers, laborers, artisans,
Yeah.
middle and lower classes.
Exactly. Advocated for a limited central government. Power should stay mostly with the states. Best government governs least, was the idea.
Strict interpretation of the Constitution.
Very much so, especially the 10th Amendment. Wanted to pay off the national debt quickly, agrarian focus, no special favors for industry.
Big on freedom of speech and foreign policy. Pro-France.
Generally, yes. They saw the French Revolution, initially at least, as echoing America's own fight for liberty.
That brings us nicely to foreign policy and the French Revolution. It was the major dividing line, wasn't it?
Absolutely. More than almost any domestic issue, it split Federalists and Republicans.
Initially, most Americans supported it.
Yeah, especially Jeffersonians. They saw it as France following America's example, liberty spreading.
But then things got darker. The Reign of Terror, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette executed, attacks on religion.
Right. And American reactions diverged sharply. Jeffersonians tended to see the violence as regrettable, maybe even necessary, but still supported the revolution's overall goals.
While Federalists were.
Horrified, frightened by the radicalism, the bloodshed, it reinforced their fears about mob rule and made them even warier of the Jeffersonian masses.
And when France went to war with Britain, the U.S. was caught in the middle.
Big time. We actually had a treaty with France from 1778 promising to help defend their West Indies.
So technically, we were obligated to help France. Jeffersonians thought so.
They did. But Washington, he believed the U.S. was just too weak, too fragile to get involved in a major European war.
Survival first.
Exactly. Both Hamilton and Jefferson actually agreed on that core point. Avoid war.
So Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793.
Declaring the U.S. neutral, warning citizens to stay impartial.
How did that go down?
Jeffersonians were outraged, especially since Washington didn't consult Congress first. Federalists naturally supported it.
And then there was that whole Citizen Genet episode, the French envoy who caused trouble.
Oh, Citizen Genet. He landed in Charleston and immediately started acting like the U.S. was already France's ally. Tried to recruit privateers, organize attacks on Spanish and British territory.
Did he think neutrality wasn't serious?
He seemed to believe it didn't reflect what Americans really wanted. He even threatened to appeal directly to the voters over Washington's head.
Big mistake.
Huge diplomatic blunder. Washington demanded France recall him. Ironically, U.S. neutrality ended up helping both sides in some ways.
How so?
We kept trading with the French West Indies, which they needed, and France didn't formally ask us to honor the '78 treaty, which might have dragged us into war and triggered a British blockade.
Okay, moving on to another really contentious foreign policy issue, the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1794.
This one was a lightning rod. Our source even calls it the most immediate cause for the Democratic-Republican Party really coalescing.
What were the main problems with Britain at this point?
Several big ones. British troops were still occupying forts on U.S. soil in the Northwest, violating the peace treaty from '83.
And stirring up trouble with Native Americans.
Yes, supplying them, encouraging attacks on settlers. Plus, the British Navy was seizing American ships trading in the West Indies.
And impressment. Taking American sailors.
A huge source of anger, forcing American sailors into the British Navy.
But the Federalists didn't want war with Britain because of trade.
Right. Hamilton's financial system depended heavily on customs duties from British imports. War would wreck that. Jeffersonians were pushing for an embargo instead.
So Washington sends John Jay to London to negotiate. Jeffersonians are suspicious from the start.
Deeply. They feared Jay, a Federalist, would sell out American interests. And Hamilton didn't help.
What did he do?
He secretly told the British what Jay's minimum demands were. He was so afraid of war, he basically undercut Jay's negotiating leverage.
Ouch. So what did Jay actually get in the treaty?
Not much, frankly. Britain again promised to leave the frontier posts. They agreed to pay for some recent ship seizures.
But no guarantees against future seizures. Or impressment. Or inciting Native Americans.
Nope, nothing on those key issues. And to top it off, Jay agreed the U.S. would pay off old pre-revolutionary debts owed to British merchants.
You can see why people were furious, especially in the South.
Exactly. Southern planters felt totally betrayed. Northern merchants might get some money back, but Southerners were footing the bill for old debts. It really energized the Democratic Republicans.
But the treaty did avert war with Britain, which was Washington's main goal.
It did achieve that. Washington pushed hard for ratification, even though he wasn't thrilled with the terms. The Senate barely approved it in 1795.
Okay, much better news on the diplomatic front with the Pinckney Treaty, also 1795, with Spain this time.
Yes, a clear win for the U.S. Spain was worried about a possible U.S.-British alliance after Jay's treaty, and their own power was waning.
So they were willing to make concessions.
Big ones. Free navigation of the Mississippi River for Americans, absolutely vital for Western farmers.
Including the right of deposit at New Orleans, meaning they could transfer goods there without paying Spanish taxes.
Crucial for trade. And Spain also agreed to the U.S. border claim at the 31st parallel, giving up disputed territory north of Florida. A major diplomatic success.
Meanwhile, on the frontier itself, conflict with Native American tribes was ongoing.
Very much so. After the Revolution, the Iroquois in New York were mostly contained. But further west in the Ohio Valley, tribes like the Shawnee in Miami were resisting American expansion, often with British encouragement.
The U.S. military had some early struggles there.
Yes, significant defeats in 1790 and 91. It took General Mad Anthony Wayne's victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in '94 to really break the Native American Confederacy in the Northwest.
And that led to the Treaty of Greenville.
In 1795, Native tribes ceded huge amounts of land in Ohio and Indiana. That, plus the British finally leaving their forts after the Jay Treaty, really opened the floodgates for settlement.
But devastating for the Native Americans.
Absolutely. Their traditional way of life was being destroyed by settlement, loss of hunting grounds. It pushed many further west, leading to more conflict. Attempts to adapt or resist were largely unsuccessful.
As Washington's time in office wound down, he delivered his famous farewell address.
Right. He'd reluctantly served a second term, unanimously reelected again, but he was tired of the partisan attacks.
He'd lost that above the fray status.
Yeah, the Jeffersonians were often fiercely critical by then, so he decided not to seek a third term, setting that powerful precedent.
And the address itself, what were the key messages?
Two main warnings. First, against the dangers of political parties and factionalism, the partisan bitterness he saw growing.
Seems relevant today.
Doesn't it? And second, a warning against permanent foreign alliances, like the one they still technically had with France. He advocated for trade, but minimal political connection.
Which the Jeffersonians saw as anti-French.
They did. But that advice really shaped U.S. foreign policy for a century, the idea of isolationism.
But his biggest achievement, arguably, was just keeping the U.S. out of war during those critical early years.
A huge accomplishment. Plus, other precedents. Relying on the cabinet, choosing his own cabinet, the two-term limit, looking outside the Supreme Court for a new Chief Justice. Very influential.
So Washington steps down, which leads to the first truly contested presidential election, 1796.
Federalist nominating Vice President John Adams. Hamilton was just too controversial by then.
And the Democratic Republicans ran Jefferson.
Yep, campaigning against things like the Whiskey Rebellion crackdown and the Jay Treaty.
And Adams won.
Barely. Adams got 71 electoral votes, Jefferson got 66.
But under the rules back then, the runner-up became vice president.
Exactly. So you had a Federalist president, John Adams, and the leader of the opposition, Thomas Jefferson, as his vice president. Awkward.
Talk about setting the stage for conflict, which leads us to the quasi-war with France.
Right. The French Directory government was furious about the Jay Treaty, saw it as the U.S. siding with Britain, violating the '78 alliance.
So they started seizing American ships.
Yes. And they refused to even formally receive the American ambassador Adams sent.
Then came the XYZ affair. That sounds like something out of a spy novel.
Kind of was. Adams sent a delegation to try and negotiate. But French agents, referred to only as X, Y, and Z in the official reports, demanded a huge bribe and a loan just to start talking.
Wow. How did that go over back home?
It caused an absolute uproar. War hysteria swept the country. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became the slogan.
So undeclared naval war.
Pretty much. From 1798 to 1800, the U.S. created the Navy Department, authorized an army, suspended trade with France. American ships were told to capture armed French vessels.
Most of the fighting was in the Caribbean.
Yes.
Yeah.
U.S. ships captured quite a few French vessels, but American merchant ships took losses too. Adams, though, despite pressure from hardline high Federalists like Hamilton, wanted to avoid full-blown war.
And he managed it. The Convention of 1800.
He did. Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, also wanted peace. Adams sent a new mission against fierce opposition from his own party. Napoleon was in power by then.
And they reached a deal.
Yes. It formally ended the 1778 alliance. The U.S. dropped its claims for damages from French seizures.
So Adams avoided a major war, maybe paved the way for the Louisiana Purchase leader.
Arguably, yes. Adams himself called it his finest moment, even though it cost him politically with his own party.
Speaking of costing the Federalists, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, hugely controversial.
Deeply divisive. Passed by the Federalist Congress during the anti-French frenzy. Their real aim.
Reduce the power of the Jeffersonians, silence opposition.
Pretty much. The Alien Acts targeted immigrants who often leaned Jeffersonian, raised the citizenship requirement from 5 to 14 years, gave the president power to deport dangerous foreigners.
Were they actually used much?
Not really enforced heavily, but they created a climate of fear. Some immigrants left.
But the Sedition Act was the really alarming one.
Absolutely. It made it a crime to impede government policies or falsely defame government officials, including the president. A direct shot at the First Amendment.
And the Federalist courts didn't challenge it.
Nope. Several Jeffersonian newspaper editors were actually prosecuted and convicted under it. It was set to expire right after the next election, conveniently.
But people bought into it initially because of the war fever.
To some extent. The Federalists actually did well in the 1798-99 congressional elections, but the backlash was building.
Leading to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, penned by Jefferson and Madison.
Secretly, yes, passed by those state legislatures. They argued the Alien and Sedition Acts were flat out unconstitutional.
But judicial review wasn't fully established yet, so who decides?
Exactly. They put forward the compact theory, the idea that the states created the federal government through a compact, so the states could judge if the federal government overstepped.
And if a state decided a law was unconstitutional?
They argue the state had the right to nullify it, declare it void within their borders.
Did other states join in?
No, none formally adopted the resolutions. But they were powerful statements of states' rights, really campaign documents, rallying opposition.
And that nullification idea, it pops up later, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. Southerners used it later to justify secession. Federalists argue the people made the compact, and the Supreme Court should decide constitutionality. A fundamental debate.
Which all sets the stage for the election of 1800, the Revolution of 1800.
A truly pivotal election.
Yeah.
The Federalists were in trouble.
Why? What were their handicaps?
They were split badly over Adams making peace with France. Hamilton's faction was furious. The Alien and Sedition Acts were deeply unpopular by now.
And the taxes for the war buildup that didn't fully happen.
People resented those too. Plus, the Federalists threw a lot of mud at Jefferson personally.
Accusations of atheism, robbing a widow, the Sally Hemings rumor.
All that stuff. Pretty nasty campaign.
But Jefferson won.
He defeated Adams, 73 electoral votes to 65. Strong support from the South and West where more men could vote. New York was key, thanks partly to Aaron Burr's organizing.
But then a tie between Jefferson and his own running mate, Burr.
Exactly. Both got 73 votes. So the election went to the House of Representatives.
And the Federalists in the House could decide. They must have hated Jefferson.
They did. Many wanted to throw the election to Burr. But then Hamilton stepped in.
Hamilton helping Jefferson, seriously.
He disliked Jefferson intensely, but he distrusted Burr even more. Thought Burr was unprincipled, dangerous.
So Hamilton persuaded some Federalists
to abstain, basically, which finally gave Jefferson the victory on the 36th ballot. But Burr never forgave Hamilton.
Setting up that future duel. Wow. But the big significance of 1800.
The peaceful transfer of power from one party to its rival based on an election. That was revolutionary. It showed the system could work, even with deep divisions.
So summing up the Federalist era, what's the legacy?
It was a period of incredible talent, founding fathers building something new, Washington's leadership, Hamilton's financial architecture. They built lasting foundations.
Kept the country out of major wars, signed some good treaties.
Preserved the gains of the Revolution, avoided chaos, and ironically, their opposition helped create the two-party system.
But they ultimately faded. Why?
Couldn't adapt, really. Couldn't connect with the expanding country. The common voter became seen as the party of the elite.
So in just those 12 years or so, 1789 to 1801, an incredible amount happened.
A functioning government, a financial system, huge debates over federal power, the start of parties, navigating tricky foreign relations.
They faced immense challenges, but really laid the groundwork for everything that came after.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought for you, the listener. When you look at the deep divides, the fierce debates, the fundamental questions raised back then.
What echoes of the Federalist era do you still see in American politics and society today? Something to think about.
Definitely. Keep exploring those sources. Keep thinking about how this foundational period continues to shape the present.